watching a recording of a residents meeting with Middle Watershed residents, part of Building Resilience Across the Charles River Watershed, a project put together by the Charles River Watershed Association. So this is some of the stuff that will be covered in this video. There will be a presentation about this project, an overview of different green infrastructure solutions, some talk about flooding scenarios, and then a Q&A of the project. If you're looking for the survey, you can find it in the description in this YouTube link, as well as other recordings in the project webpage. And unfortunately, the recording cut out a little bit of this, but Julie was just talking about what this project is. It's essentially a flood monitoring system that can simulate different flooding scenarios across the Charles River watershed, and it can predict those flooding scenarios over different timescales with different amounts of precipitation. This tool will also be able to test different nature-based solutions, and from there we can go ahead and start the original recording.
Mitigation strategies. In this project, we will be focusing primarily on nature-based solutions, and Ethan's going to give an overview of what those are and what types we're looking at in this project. And then another important elements of the project are engaging and informing watershed residents like yourselves. We hope that this tool will be a valuable community planning resource for communities across the Charles River watershed. And so we want to be very open and transparent about what's going on, how it's being done, and engage as many residents as possible, really from the get-go. So we'll have some time, as Ethan said, for discussion and questions, so that people sort of understand what this is, and understand how it might help your community plan for climate change. Next slide. And why are we doing it at a watershed scale? When you're talking about flooding, there's really almost no other scale that's appropriate to look at. Basically, the watershed is the land area that drains to the river. So it defines how water flows across our landscape, and ultimately ends up in the Charles River. So while a lot of things in Massachusetts are done at the community level, when you're talking about flooding, you really need to look more broadly. You need to span out a little bit, because the reality is what's happening in upstream communities in the watershed, communities like Milford, Bellingham, Franklin, can in fact have a direct impact on what's on the experience in the downstream communities. So we really need to think from a watershed scale when we're talking about flooding, and also when we're talking about how we might mitigate flooding, because opportunities may exist upstream to store some water when the benefits would be really felt downstream. So it really needs to be a regional watershed scale conversation. So again, we're so excited to have so many communities participating. Next slide. And we're not getting too technical tonight, but just, again, a real quick overview of what's going on here. It is a computer model. It's using a software called PC Swim. It's just a commercial software package that is designed to do this kind of thing. And basically, you put in all the information that you have available about your land surface, about how water moves, about your stormwater pipes, about bridges and culverts and things that affect the way the water flows and where it's flowing. You put that all into the computer, and then the computer will build this simulation of the watershed. And then what you can do is you can run different scenarios with different rainfall conditions. So we will probably look at some current day storms, so a storm we might expect any day now, and then we will also be using state guidance for future scenario storms. So a storm that would be very, very rare in 2020, but may become pretty common 30 and 50 years from now. And you run this all through the computer simulation. And what it does is it shows you where flooding will occur across the community. It can also show you in some cases how severe it is, usually meaning how deep it is, which can also give you a sense of how long is that flooding water going to be there, how much might we need to adapt in that location. And then, like I said, the last thing it can do is it can help you assess what flood mitigation strategies might have the biggest impact.
Awesome.
So that's it for me. I think I'm handing it back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Julie. Julie just covered a lot about what I was going to talk about in this slide, which is, why is this tool different than other flood monitoring systems that municipalities might use? So some people may be familiar with the Cambridge Flood Viewer, which actually includes Cambridge and Boston, super detailed and accurate. And the production of the tool that CRWA produces in this first phase is probably not going to be as detailed at that. But when you look to the image of the right, as Julie pointed out, it provides really detailed information, but it's constrained by, human-made boundaries. And we obviously know that rainfall doesn't work that way. Flooding doesn't work that way. So this watershed model is actually going to help inform other detailed models like this. It's going to help inform municipal models that may already exist in your town. And it can also provide a lot of additional information for upstream communities who, so they can make the same kind of progress. And to the left, you'll see the FEMA flood maps, commonly used by residents, businesses, municipal planners. These are super accessible. You can just find one online through a quick search, but they do test for a limited amount of factors. They don't have that same kind of time scale that Julie's talking about of like testing for that, storm that might be 30 years later, really, really common. And sometimes these have been proven faulty. So in 2017, there was a Homeland Security study that found that over 58% of these flood maps were actually inaccurate or outdated. And that actually puts communities at risk when we have this kind of crumbling stormwater infrastructure. And just one other cool thing that's really sets this tool apart is it actually is able to not just visualize the challenges that we're going to face through flooding, but it's also going to be able to, like Julie said, test those potential solutions and see how nature-based solutions will work and what kind of impact they'll have. So speaking of nature-based solutions, I'm going to quickly go over a couple of these. Definitely feel free to look into these on your own time. This is going to be kind of a bare bones run through, but you have things like reducing impervious surfaces, which helps reduce the impacts of rainfall. So that's basically replacing things that are impervious, so like concrete, cement, asphalt, where water can't flow through those, and replacing them with things like gravel, sand, stuff which allows water to flow through them and replenish our aquifers. So some of the pros about that, it's obviously there's less surface water, you're using natural resources in your roads, and there's some serious long-term savings that we can get from that. Then you have green stormwater infrastructure that's using vegetation, soil, plants to manage stormwater. So you commonly see this with like tree canopies or bioswales, or sometimes people have rainwater harvesting or rain gardens. So all of that is green water storm infrastructure using natural services essentially to help mitigate flooding. And it also helps clean water, and they're really good for draining after storms. And then finally, you have stuff like increasing tree canopy, which provides many benefits. With groundwater, again, it's absorbing water through the roots, and the canopy of the trees themselves actually helps distribute the amount of water that is landing on the ground, which can be helpful. And they provide other functions as well. They cool areas, they reduce noise and stress, and can prevent erosion as well. And then some of the larger scale, bigger nature-based solutions include things like land conservation. So that's essentially just protecting the natural land that we have right now, which is performing a lot of those ecosystem services I talked about. So these natural bodies of land are already helping mitigate flooding. It also involves returning developed land to its natural state and kind of restoring that. And like I said, this provides a plethora of resources for mitigating flooding. Then you have, in a similar vein, wetland restoration, which is using different methods to restore wetlands, restore damaged wetlands, or even create new ones in places where wetlands used to exist. And those are really great for buffering storms. They can soak up a lot of flood water and again, prevent erosion. And both of those actually provide other services like bringing back natural habitats for wildlife, which can also fight climate change and extreme weather in its own ways. And then you have floodplain reconnection. And we have a link that we can put in later to explain more what floodplains are, but they're essentially big flat areas where sediment has built up, and it's where the water kind of naturally flows. And through the construction of our cities and urban environments and neighborhoods, we have time and again separated different floodplains because we needed a road there or housing or parking. And because of that, we keep diverting the water around, and it makes for a really kind of ineffective flood system that can be overburdened by these increased precipitation that we're experiencing now through climate change. So a lot of that is trying to reconnect floodplains back together. Again, it provides a natural way for water to flow and brings back natural environments. And then you have things like reservoir management, which a lot of groups are doing now, which is just maintaining a body of water, making sure it has high water quality and that it's safe and healthy for both wildlife and people. So those are just a few of the pros of nature-based solutions. And this is a great table put together by CRWA, and it kind of shows the multiple benefits that each of these different solutions can have. So if you look at this, you can see like land conservation, it promotes biodiversity, it also improves water quality. So this is a really good way to visualize what these different nature-based solutions do, and maybe which ones would be best for your community or which ones might not work. It's also really important to recognize some of the drawbacks of green infrastructure. Because it all sounds great, a lot of us appreciate nature and greenery and being around wildlife. And we especially appreciate being prepared for flooding and being safer from that in ways that are better for the environment. But at the same time, these projects involve a lot of planning, design, they're timely and costly. They also involve construction permits, and there's plenty of other complications around, is this going to work for disabled people? Is this solution designed with all the community members in mind? It's also important to recognize that these projects can also increase property value. So I've put a couple examples here of places where that's happened, but a study called Just Green Enough by the Rutledge Equity Justice Sustainable City Program, they've found direct links between the creation of green infrastructure, whether that be new parks or rain gardens and other sustainability initiatives, that these can actually fuel really expensive redevelopment. And they can push out the original residents, some of which who have been dealing with these climate-related stressors for their whole lives. So it's important to try to tease out how we can separate these really great environmental ideas with high-end economic development. So on the right-hand side, you can see Highline Park. A lot of people are familiar with that. Really successful greenway made in the middle of New York City. But at the same time, it brought in over $2 billion worth of private investment. And that drastically changed the meatpacking district. And if you go to New York, you can see how much Chelsea has changed because of this park. And then over to the left-hand side, you can see some of the nature-based solutions proposed by Ready Climate Boston. I think it's a beautiful image, but we need to keep in mind how this is going to change development in our city, and how this beautification and introduction of more greenery could increase how much it costs to live in a certain area. So with this whole project, when we talk about building resilience, it's become something of a buzzword, especially over this year with COVID and all the trials that people have been through. Some communities have been suffered and have been hit far harder, but we've all found that there's a need for recovery and this ability to bounce back. And that's essentially what resilience is. It's our ability to keep functioning despite disturbances. So disturbances within the Charles River Watershed would include climate change and all the extreme unpredictable weather that will come with it, including the flooding and the increased precipitation, and things like sea level rise and backflooding. But like I mentioned, disturbances could also come from the development projects themselves, from the rezoning and all the actions that are coming out of these nature-based solutions. So one of the reasons we've asked you all here tonight is to open up kind of a line of communication between residents, organizations like CREW and Charles River Watershed Association, and all the different town municipalities that are working on this project, and connecting them with residents. So this tool is primarily going to be used right now by municipal planners for regulations and to guide future decisions. But we want to build trust with this tool. We want residents to understand how it works, and that you can feel confident that the decisions that are being made on flooding are being made with the best possible information coming from this tool. That being said, we also really want to incorporate your thoughts and ideas into this project. So that includes what kind of nature-based solutions we should be testing. That includes what timelines we should be looking at for these extreme precipitation events, for flooding events. You know, should we be testing for stuff 10 years down the road, or should it be a bigger timeline? And then we're also just have a space open for kind of any general comments, concerns, or questions about this project. Obviously, some of this information will be used right away, and some of it we can incorporate, you know, as this project grows and as municipalities actually start implementing some of the nature-based solutions. Your feedback will also be very important then. So one of the best ways to achieve climate resilience is by engaging stakeholders who are directly involved in these kind of projects. And like Julie said, we really want to get people engaged in this from the very beginning. So what a stakeholder is it's typically someone you know, who's involved and directly affected by complex challenges. So when we think about the stakeholders in the entirety of the watershed, you know, if you're calling in from somewhere in the Charles, like, you are a stakeholder. Everyone that lives in your community is a stakeholder, whether they work for a municipality or maybe they've lived there their whole life. So either one, you know, is a stakeholder, and they all bring, you know, a large diversity of different ways of knowledge and information. So, you know, knowledge is defined as facts, skills, information that someone's gained through experience or education. And this is a really great graphic that kind of explains 4 different kinds of knowledge as they're understood. So you have something at foundational knowledge, which is something that we all have. And that is essentially how we interact with the world around us. It's a compound of who we are and everything that's happened to ourselves. And it includes things like your experience. It includes things like kind of your values and how you think the world should look. But it also includes citizen knowledge. It includes the knowledge that you have fostered with other individuals in your community as a product of like all of your daily lives. So that's a really trustworthy source of information because it stems from a collective experiential knowledge. And it's held by a really relevant group of people because those citizens are going to have a certain expertise that has kind of a long history behind it. Then you have things like indigenous knowledge, really important. It reflects the history of indigenous people. Their stories give us insight to historical perspectives by past and future events. And then you have spiritual knowledge, which people usually get through dedicated prayer or study. And that can provide individuals with purpose, sense of value. Spiritual knowledge is usually just supports a lot of people's decision-making. So that's kind of in the personal side. And then you have things like generalized knowledge, which is scientific. We get it from experimentation and theories. Generalized knowledge is what's going to go into how this tool actually works and how it tests different scenarios. And then you have artistic knowledge, which is, again, commonly not really used or emphasized in the environmental realm of things and the planning realm of things. But artistic knowledge creates representations of experience and information through kind of abstract forms of art. So that could either be movement or dance or written or oral word or visual interpretation of something. And then you have practical knowledge, which is taking that generalized knowledge and applying it in action It's everything that we've learned essentially through trial and error. And when we look at all this, it's really easy to see that when decisions are made, they lean super heavily on the practical and generalized knowledge. And we kind of leave behind the artistic and foundational information. And what happens when we leave that out is we ignore a lot of really relevant information that stakeholders have. And because of that, people tend to be left out of solutions. So maybe since their information wasn't valued, they're left out of the planning process. And because of that, now all this place-based knowledge that they have can no longer be used. And when that happens, we find that solutions start to become irrelevant. Something might happen in a community and everyone is wondering, you know, who asked for this? So that's where stakeholder engagement becomes extremely important. And then in the worst case scenario, following that kind of chain of events, you have people being disproportionately impacted because solutions didn't take in their voices. So crew does a lot of emergency management. That's kind of our side of things. And we see this a lot when it comes to emergency management because there isn't enough effort made to reach all the communities in a certain area. And when a disaster happens, like say like Katrina in New Orleans, you have, you know, primarily Black and Brown and Hispanic communities dealing with the same hurricane, and they're being impacted far more. And it's a direct result of not incorporating their voices, not including them in planning processes. So it's really important to engage stakeholders because as we can see, the worst case scenario, it kind of reinforces historical issues that we have in this country. Sorry, I'll just skip through those. So like I said, residents are community experts, and real effective, equitable solutions require everyone to be involved. So while bringing on more people into a project can often make it more complicated and complex because now you're getting all these different people bringing up different ideas. Sometimes they're bringing up problems that you didn't even think existed. But at the same time, it's a good signal that everyone's at the table and everyone's being heard. And there's so much information that crew and CRWA still doesn't have that you all have learned and gained through your life experiences in your communities. And like I said, too often our environmental solutions lean really heavy on that science tech side of things, and we're not leaning enough on the immense social capital that people have, that kind of people power. In the same vein, it's really important we want to recognize that this work is ongoing. You know, we're still trying really hard when we think about who's on the Zoom call right now. There's a lot of people who can't be here, maybe because they're deaf of hard of hearing, or they're part of the blind community. Maybe they don't have, you know, reliable internet connection, or they just don't have the time because they need to work right now and they can't just be at some Zoom meeting. And then it's also really important to recognize voices that have historically been silenced, ignored, such as communities of color, LGBTQIA+ communities, often immigrant communities and low-income communities. So we do want to recognize that we're still trying to incorporate those people, and there's still so much more that needs to happen to do that. And with that, I would actually like to plug an event that one of our colleagues at Crew is going to be doing. So as we continue to grow and try to learn more about incorporating everyone and kind of baking in equity into our projects, if people are looking for ways that they can continue this conversation and engage more with this kind of stuff, Crew is going to host a DEI, which stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion centered event. And this is going to be for building like an equitable emergency management in our community. So if people want to go, that's happening Tuesday, April 20th at 3 p.m. And there should be a link in the chat. And so there's going to be several speakers, and they're going to be talking about the unequal impacts of climate change and then how we can start to address those. So if people want to get involved with that, there's certainly options. And with that, we'll take a little break here and we can read off some of the questions that we have in the chat. We'll also take some time too if people want to come off mute and ask questions. These, we're gonna specifically field questions that are about the tool itself or about the engagement. So yeah, Anna, if we have any questions, feel free to read them.
Yeah, we have two questions right now. The first one is from David J., who asks about beavers who were plentiful in pre-colonial times, and he asks, what are the consequences to the natural systems by the reduction and elimination of the beavers? And if we're thinking about the Charles River watershed, how does this relate to the tool and thinking about that?
Thanks, Anna. I can jump in. Really interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't really have a specific answer for David as far as what is the impact specifically of the loss of beavers. But I think David really hits it on the head, that, you know, the Charles River system has been so completely altered from its natural state. And that is, you know, all across the watershed. So certainly, you know, something like beavers that have really a direct sort of symbiotic relationship with the river, you know, now moving out, or, you know, being sort of huddled in certain areas, completely developing the landscape. We have filled in so much of the wetlands. We have dammed the river. So we acknowledge it's a very altered system, you know, that we're working on. And one of the reasons that we do really put so much interest and emphasis into nature-based solutions is because they can help us to some extent reestablish some of those natural processes, some of those natural systems within the reality that we're in a very built and urban environment. So we may, you know, we are unlikely to get rid of all the development. You know, we are unlikely to have an unimpacted beaver population again. But can we use some of these engineered techniques to try to start to recreate that? And so that's really what we're looking at. You know, just big picture. That's sort of like our big picture umbrella lens at Charles River Watershed Association. And this model is one tool that will help us do that. You know, and a lot of our other work is, or really all of our other work is focused in this same vein. So I'm sorry, I don't have an expert answer. Yeah, I see people are saying they get beavers. We get a fair number of beaver conflict issues coming up, so they're still around, but it's a good question. You know, it's certainly nothing like, you know, would have been pre-development, obviously.
Thank you.
If I may, is there any connection between any of the green infrastructure nature-based solutions that would be helpful for wildlife and beaver populations?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly wetlands can provide beaver, you know, beaver habitats, especially like wooded or forested wetlands, and land conservation. You know, those are two that jump to mind that, you know, tend to be good habitat builders.
Thank you for that. And our next question is from Les Kaufman, who asks, what about the Ponkapoab and Nipmuc as stakeholders? Do we hear their voices? And I also just wanted to link a website in the chat that lets you see where you are in terms of the indigenous land and the indigenous people that were once on the land that were pushed off, and especially in New England, that's really important to acknowledge as we think about these types of projects.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing that link. Yes, Les, we're definitely reaching out and trying to make those connections because we at CRWA, you know, are not the first protectors of this river, and not, you know, I mean, I just really like that ways of knowing slide, or the knowledge category slides that Ethan goes through, to understand, you know, those different types of knowledge. Because I think, like Ethan emphasized, you know, this project and a lot of projects like this really do live in that practical, you know, box. And so we are trying to break out of that with this for sure.
Yeah, we've reached out to some Indigenous representative groups in Massachusetts during our outreach with kind of like some response, some not. One thing historically to think about, the historical context that's really disappointing all across the Eastern Seaboard, is that so many of the tribes that existed here were forcibly removed through the Indian Removal Act. So that has a significant kind of shift in the demographics that we have here on the East Coast when you compare to like tribes that are out west and have still been able to maintain kind of strongholds in their like the communities that they've always lived in. So yes, we're definitely on stolen land, and that's something we need to keep striving for. So thank you so much for raising that point.
Yeah, thank you both for those answers and that question also. The next question is from Anne Marie, who asks, are you reaching out to each municipality to get digital information about the details of their drainage system, underground pipes, and are you able to incorporate this information into your model? She's particularly concerned to incorporate the same level of drain information as in the Cambridge flood viewer, but for other towns.
Okay, great question, Anne Marie. So the 15 communities that are participating in the project have all provided that information. One thing I should have mentioned about this project when I gave the overview, it is a bit of a sprint. This project is being funded by a state grant. It's the state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant Program. And what it means that it's funded by a state grant, it means it follows the state's fiscal calendar. So this, basically this project is starting and ending in one fiscal year. So, and the end date for the state's fiscal year is June 30th. So we are, and Ethan sort of alluded to this, we are really considering this sort of a phase one, setting up the tool, and then it will grow. So to get pretty specific about your question, Anne Marie, from the 15 communities, we have all their stormwater pipes and are loading basically the largest ones into the model. So, you know, on the smaller residential roads, you know, the little pipes that collect all from those, they will not be in the model at this phase. That's just a constraint of resources and time at this point. We have them all. We'd love to get more funding to add them. And then there were a few additional communities basically that just because of their location in the watershed and because of their land area contributory to the watershed, we did also have to reach out to those. So I think it's about 20 communities that have their underground stormwater drainage systems will be modeled in this phase.
The next question is from Sally, who asks, has this tool been tested elsewhere and how well does it work? And I also just want to say that we're going to have to end our Q&A session sort of soon, but please feel free to stay after the Zoom ends and we can continue to answer your questions especially when they're more specific. But to Sally's question, has this tool been tested and how well does it work?
So the software that we're using to build this model is standard and used in other organizations. When you're talking about any model, the question of how well it works is really dependent on how good of the quality is the data you put in there, since you know you're feeding the computer all the information basically. So we'll do that, and then what you do is calibrate it against a real world storm. So once we've done that piece of it, Sally, I'd be able to answer your question much more specifically. So you build your model, and then you say, well, this was a rain event that happened. What are the results? And then you look at those results and see, well, is that really where we saw the flooding during this big storm?
The next question is from Maureen, who would like to know, does this modeling enter any information that recognizes the natural bottom of the Charles River, as well as measure the depth of what should be seen as silt?
No, bottom, like the depth, yes. But no, not too much. Like the quality of what the river bottom is does not come into play too much. That would not be a big influencing factor.
And will this tool be able to estimate the benefit of daylighting a culverted stream?
Yes, it would be able to do that.
And then this last question I'm going to give to Ethan, which is, can you guys quickly mention what your outreach has looked like thus far, especially in the minority communities of Boston and Cambridge areas?
Yeah, I can answer that. I would say it still has been really challenging and is like an ongoing learning process, just to be like completely honest about the whole thing. And we at Crew have been trying to learn more how we can bolster our outreach into those communities, because like I said, with the same with the indigenous populations, it's really hit or miss. And we've reached out to a lot of different groups that are engaged in other kind of fields or social issues. So we've reached out to some housing groups, and groups that are in touch with low-income communities, with minority communities. We've reached into racial justice groups. So sometimes it's just hard to find like the overlap. And I think it's because a lot of people are concerned with other possibly more pressing stuff than this. But yeah, it's been rocky, but we want to keep improving it. And definitely, like, if people have suggestions how we can continue to improve it. One thing that's been insanely helpful is like just getting in touch with community-based organizations goes such a far way. Like, if we can get a solid contact at like a mutual aid group, we find that that helps us share this event. Whereas the kind of like, once you are just doing the cold emailing, it gets a little more difficult and kind of spotted results. But yeah, ongoing process. Please like reach out if you have suggestions or changes that you would like to see, or you have groups that you would recommend us reaching out to. Please share that with us. Thank you for that question.
And there's one last question that I'm hoping. Les asks, whatever happened to the state program called Communities Connected by Watersheds, and shouldn't it be resurrected for climate change adaptation?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. Definitely looking, as I already said, we think looking at the watershed scale is important. The state has moved away from that a little bit, but they may move back toward that. So.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your questions. And like, definitely, if you feel like you didn't get your question answered, you can definitely shoot it in the breakout room sessions. It will be recorded there, both in note form and a recording, or stay after. We'll definitely stay on for a couple minutes if you really have a pressing question. But with that, if people could just take a quick chance to fill out this feedback survey. This survey is going to kind of directly influence what is being tested and what kind of timelines are being tested. So that should be in the chat now. Just go ahead and take 2 to 3 minutes to fill that out. It'd be really helpful to do so. So thank you.